Maybe y'all can hear this noise outside my office while I'm recording this. That's my wife running a pressure washer. I tell her to turn it off, but I've been after her to get the house pressure washed off. We got a little moss and algae growing on the siding. Then I'm going to put her up under the tractor and get her to change oil and the hydraulic fluid, because she's got a couple of fields she needs to bush hog and a garden to till, and I need her to move some gravel. Now I'm going to go inside and eat a bologna sandwich, pull a chair up, and just watch her work. She's pretty good at this. Hey, seriously, welcome to the video. We got 2 stories. One reminder before we get into the rest of the video. About a month ago, I put up a video called 100,000 Subscriber Contest. We have reached 100,000 subscribers. It's a miracle. It's unbelievable to me, and I appreciate you all so much. But there's a contest that we haven't drawn for yet. We probably won't be able to do it for the next 2 weeks or so. So you still have a chance to go back to that video, watch that video, follow the instructions in that video, and learn how to get in the contest to win a DJI Mavic Mini drone. Go back and check it out. I'll put it at the end screen of this video. I'll put an iCard up here if you want to go over and do it now. That's all I want to say. Let's jump into these stories. All right, here we go. This email's from Jacob. I have a couple of pretty tame encounters I'd like to share. In 2015, I moved to Montana. I'd always loved the idea of living in the mountains and exploring in nature. By 2016, I had finally become a resident and was chomping at the bit to go on my first deer hunt up in Little Bear Canyon south of Bozeman. I had driven up the 10-mile access road using my spotting scope along the way. I'd spotted a really nice buck mule deer along with a few does up on the side of Wheeler Mountain. I parked at the base, partially blocking an ATV trail to let people know the area was occupied. I walked for about a mile and then tested the wind. I figured if I went straight for them, they'd catch my scent and my hunt would be over for the day. I decided to make my way around the mountain above them and come down from the top. After about 3 hours of stalking carefully, making sure not to spook anything else that would alert the deer to my presence, I finally made it to the top. It was very thickly forested to one side, so I decided to stick close to that tree line for cover while I worked my way down to the deer. When I got to 30 yards from the trees, I began hearing some kind of grunting. I stopped, thinking maybe it was a bear or some other large creature. I couldn't make out the sound very well, but whatever it was definitely knew I was there and was walking towards it. I took a knee and I listened. It had grunted off and on for about 5 minutes when I heard what sounded like a large branch breaking. Now I was thinking it might be a moose. Everything went dead silent. I checked the place where I'd last seen the deer to see if they were still there, and they were, but now they were looking in my direction. I remained down on one knee, not moving an inch, and began slowing my breath to try to keep calm. I thought whatever it was would lose interest in me and move off. I looked back over the tree line, squinting to try and locate the source of all the noise. The sun was up all the way by now, warming my cheeks against the frosty air. It was 7 a.m. Shadows were casting everywhere in the forest. Another 5 minutes passed since I'd heard the limbs snap, and I hadn't seen anything else, so I turned my attention back to the deer. I didn't want to walk into the forest after all that noise, so I looked for a different route to get down to them. I saw one game trail that was my best bet, and due to the fresh layer of snow that had fallen that morning, my least slippery option. Unfortunately, it took me closer to the thick forest. With my hand resting on the grip of my sidearm, I started walking towards the trail. I was only 10 yards from the trees when a perfectly healthy, maybe 8-inch in diameter lodgepole pine fell across the trail that I was planning to take. At this point, I was feeling nervous, so I decided maybe something or someone was just saying, "This isn't your day." And since sound of the crashing tree had sent the deer bounding over the next ridge, I made the decision to not test whatever was stopping me. I turned around and went back to my truck, following the same way that I had come in. I have a great respect for nature and conservation. I've hunted deer since I've been old enough to hunt on my own, and I listen very closely to what nature tells me. In 2015, I not only moved to Montana, I also got my CDL. Needless to say, I've spent a lot of time trucking in Montana, and here's my second encounter. At the beginning of 2019, in early February, I was asked to haul a load of hay down to the Utah-Idaho state line. The weather was bad the night before, so I decided to leave a couple of hours later than usual to allow the road crews time to sand the roads. It was 9:18 a.m., and I will never forget it. I was almost 30 miles south of Enos, Montana, going about 45 miles an hour. The roads were still a little slick, and I was taking my time and being careful. I was almost to the point where the road parallels the Madison River. As I rounded the bend, I looked down into the clearing across the river, and there it was. It was about 150 yards from the road, covered in black hair from head to toe. It was walking back towards the forest, but it stopped and turned to look back at me. Its shoulders were extremely broad, and it was incredibly tall. Its hair was blowing in the wind that was coming off the canyon. I had a perfect view of it. There was no question about what I was seeing. There was a small mound up ahead that was going to block my view for a split second, so I slowed down. When I came to the mound, I decided if I saw it again on the other side, I was going to stop and try to take a picture. And it was still there, but running towards the forest now. By the count of 3, it had covered the roughly 200 yards from the river to the forest, and it was gone. I called a friend of mine who lives in Indiana first. He's a strong believer in Bigfoot, and I told him what I saw. He said, "Finally, I'm not alone." I've always loved movies and stories about Bigfoot. My wife and I often talked about the possibilities of seeing one. She's somewhat of a believer, so I called her next. I had debated about telling her for a good reason, and our conversation went something like this. "Good morning, darling. You'll never believe what I just saw." "Really? What did you see?" "I finally saw a Bigfoot." And she started to laugh at me. "Yeah, right." "No, seriously." "Look, I want to believe you. Any other time I would have, if you hadn't been watching Bigfoot documentaries all weekend." Crickets started chirping. We love to go back to this conversation. We like to tease each other about it, but I don't think she will ever believe me until she sees one for herself. Unfortunately, we may never go back to where I saw it. We recently moved to Texas for my work. Hopefully one day on one of our mountain excursions, we will get another glimpse at one of these amazing creatures. And he signs off Jacob. Look, Jacob, your encounter in Montana is exciting, but the most funny, interesting, entertaining part of your story is how your wife reacted to you seeing a Bigfoot. That's hysterical, man. What a great story and a couple of good experiences, and what a great way to relay a story. And I'm glad you and your wife have a sense of humor with each other. It's all my wife and I tease each other all the time, and it's a lot of fun. It's really cool to have a spouse you can do that with, especially for a guy, because we're used to teasing each other all the time. And so, hey, this is a great story, and I really appreciate Jacob sending it. Thank you. Here's an email from someone who doesn't want their name disclosed, but she gives it a title, "The Beast on the Bayou and Bigfoot by the Highway." And here's what the woman writes. This is really good. Long before Bigfoot, or what is also known as Sasquatch in the northwestern United States and Canada, was North America's most popular legendary monster. My late father Lewis would tell of an experience he had with a similar creature when he was a young boy living on Bayou LaFourche, I think that's how you pronounce that, in southern Louisiana. My father was 10 years old at the time, and his younger brother Lloyd was approximately 7. My father was born in 1932, so this would have occurred in the early 1940s, a quarter of a century before the Patterson-Gimlin film that made Bigfoot a common phenomenon. My father would vividly recall this day in great detail. He said he could remember how it was a beautiful, sunny morning, and my grandmother had sent him and his brother to pick snap beans along the levee near the bayou for dinner. He and his brother both quickly gathered their buckets from off the back porch, glad to be able to get away from home and enjoy a beautiful sunny morning away from their mother's watchful eye. While they picked snap beans along the rows of the levee, they began to smell a horrible stench. My father remembered it to be similar to the smell of rotten eggs, only worse. My father and Uncle Lloyd decided that the horrible smell was more than likely the decaying remains of an animal. Because unpleasant odors were commonplace on the farm, this did not initially set off any alarms of what would soon become one of the most terrifying moments of their young lives. They knew their mother wanted them to fill their buckets with snap beans and return home in sufficient time for her to prepare them to cook for dinner. They decided they would pick more than enough so there would be no need for them to return to the levee. They were enjoying their time together, but that awful stench was becoming unbearable. When they decided they had picked enough snap beans to sufficiently satisfy my grandmother's needs for dinner and possibly supper, they picked up their overflowing buckets and headed home. All of a sudden, they heard a frightening guttural growl. My father said it sounded like someone who was heavily congested clearing their throat, but much deeper. The rotten egg stench was now even thicker in the air. Suddenly, a man-like creature covered in long, stringy, dark brown, matted, wet hair walked out of the wooded area near the bayou and stood right in front of my father and uncle. My father said he could distinctly remember that this creature was only about 30 to 50 feet away, and he could clearly see that it had a face that looked human but with huge, jagged teeth. The creature then let out a terrifying, piercing scream and turned and jumped into the bayou, and it swam away. My father said it was as if everything from that point was in slow motion. He remembered dropping his full bucket of snap beans and grabbing his brother by the arm as if all in one movement. Uncle Lloyd then dropped his full bucket, spilling all the contents on the ground. The two of them started running as fast as they could back towards the house. My grandmother's version of the events of that fateful morning made it all the more credible because my grandmother was never one to embellish a story. She said she looked out the window and saw my father and uncle running towards the house, that she knew instantly they were not playing a game, but that something terrible had happened. She initially believed that they had been threatened by white men, as this was southern Louisiana, and lynching of blacks were not uncommon at that time. She ran out of the house to meet them. They were both shaking and crying uncontrollably. She quickly sent one of my aunts to the field to get my grandfather to let him know that something terrible had happened to the boys. By the time my grandfather reached the house, my father and uncle had calmed down sufficiently enough to talk. My grandmother was confident that whatever happened, they would not dare lie to their father. When my grandfather asked them to tell what had happened, they recounted seeing a hairy man-like creature near the bayou. They described how this bayou beast had walked out of the trees and screamed at them with a high-pitched scream and jumped in the bayou and swam away. Because they had none of the snap beans they had spent all morning picking, and they both were still visibly shaken, my grandfather was confident they were telling the truth. My father would often end this story by saying that he did not know what he feared the most, the hairy man-like creature with the loud piercing scream, or my grandfather not believing him. My father said he was so relieved when my grandfather turned to my grandmother and said, "These boys aren't lying. They saw some type of creature. I'm certain of it." It is my father's vivid recounting of this encounter that made me know that Sasquatch is real. Oh yes, he's real. I also recently missed having my very own daytime encounter. On January 28, 2019, my sister and I both met up on a connecting flight to Birmingham, Alabama for my son's wedding. We picked up our rental car at the airport and began our hour-and-a-half trip to Huntsville, Alabama. This journey was one I have made many times by car, as I lived in Huntsville, Alabama for over 10 years. However, this particular day, I was turned around as to how to leave the airport and connect with the highway to take me to Huntsville. After driving for about 30 minutes, we decided to stop and get a bite to eat. My sister was bewildered as to how I could be so turned around and unable to get my bearings. I had only been gone from this area for 6 years. She was growing impatient, and finally we were on the correct exchange and headed to Huntsville. We even talked about what possibility made me so scatterbrained and confused. We both had a good laugh and chalked it up to old age. Not that we would be considered that old, but we laughed it off and looked forward to the next few days at my son's wedding. Just as we made the exchange onto Interstate 565 leading into Huntsville, I decided to call my soon-to-be daughter-in-law to let her know that we would be at her house shortly. I was driving and talking to her via Bluetooth, so I knew exactly what time it was. It was 3:05 p.m. My sister then looked at me and said with this really blank look on her face, "I just saw a Sasquatch." I looked at her and initially thought she was talking about a billboard or a sign for a business. I ended my phone call and turned to her and said, "What did you say?" And she repeated, "I just saw a Sasquatch." I said, "You're joking, right?" Strangely, my sister and I have never discussed the topic of Sasquatch or Bigfoot. She then said, "No, I was looking at this thing crouched down off the side of the road, as if it were trying to conceal itself in the trees. You were driving slowly so you could enter the highway and I could clearly see it. First I thought, what is an orangutan doing out there? And then I realized I was looking at a Sasquatch." There are no words to explain how I, being a Bigfoot enthusiast, felt realizing that I had missed having my own daylight sighting in the safety of a car. I told my sister, apparently that is what all my confusion was about in trying to leave Birmingham, because had we not had all of that trouble leaving Birmingham, you would never have had your sighting. We had a quick visit with my son and his soon-to-be wife, and I told them about my sister's sighting. They found it to be extremely humorous, but I was a bag of nerves because I knew she was telling the truth. I couldn't wait to check into the hotel so she could give me even more details of what she could remember in that brief moment. She did say the creature was pale-skinned and had a face that looked more Neanderthal than ape, and it had long, stringy red hair. It had a thick brow ridge and a really huge face. The head was cone-shaped, but not really as pronounced as the Patterson-Gimlin film. She said it looked more man-like than ape. Of course, I reminded my sister of our father's encounter on the Bayou. She said she remembered it and that she had always believed my father was telling the truth, but now she was certain of it. I really hate that there appear to be so many encounters all over North America and other parts of the world, and people have been made to keep their sightings and encounters to themselves. I do believe that more people that share their encounters, the more it will minimize the stigma around it, and mainstream scientists will have to take this subject more seriously. Oh, what a great story. There's a secondhand story from her father from the 1940s in South Louisiana, like she said, a quarter of a century before Patterson-Gimlin. You know, there's tons of reports of Bigfoot sightings in the swamps. I don't know what to make of all that. There's a few around here. There's a bunch down in Louisiana and South Mississippi and North Louisiana, all over the place. And then for her and her sister to have that encounter on the highway way up in Huntsville, Alabama, that's in the north part of the state. That's amazing. That's really amazing. Well, man, thank you for writing this. I really enjoyed reading it, and it was kind of nostalgic for me. But I really appreciate you. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening to the podcast. I appreciate and love every one of you. Don't forget to go back to the 100,000 subscriber contest video Follow the instructions. Just do what it says and it'll enter you in the drawing. We're going to do that in a couple of weeks. Don't forget about it. Everybody still has time, even though we've hit 100K. Doesn't mean I have to do the drawing just yet. Let's give some other people some chances too. Probably going to do maybe 2 or 3 drawings and give away a couple other smaller items, because I really do appreciate you, and I'm not rich or anything, and I don't have tons of money to buy everybody something, but I would if I could. If I was Warren Buffett or somebody like that, I'd buy everybody a drone, and just all 100,000 subscribers, I'd send you a drone. But I'm not that guy. I'm poor. I don't have much money. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you.